It began with a quiet decision hidden deep within royal archives, a decision so unexpected that even senior palace insiders reportedly struggled to believe it. When word started spreading that Princess Charlotte had been linked to one of Queen Elizabeth's most protected family treasures, the atmosphere inside royal circles changed overnight, and as whispers grew louder, one name kept surfacing alongside the controversy: Camilla. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it sounded too dramatic to be true. A young princess, still years away from her full royal duties, suddenly connected to a sapphire collection once guarded by the Queen Mother herself. Palace aides reportedly brushed it aside as nothing more than private family talk, the kind of rumor that appears, burns quickly, and disappears before anyone can prove it. But this time the whispers did not fade, they grew sharper, specific, more dangerous. Because this was not simply about a necklace, a brooch, or a forgotten velvet box in a royal vault. This was about recognition. It was about who the old monarchy believed carried the future, and who had quietly been left outside that circle of trust. The sapphire set, according to royal watchers, had remained almost invisible for years, protected not just by security but by silence. Its link to the Queen Mother gave it a weight that ordinary jewels could never carry. These pieces were not treated like decoration. They were treated like memory. They belonged to a world of duty, sacrifice, wartime strength, and royal survival. So when Charlotte's name began appearing beside them, the message felt impossible to ignore. Why Charlotte? Why now? And why did the news reportedly unsettle those who believed Camilla's position should have given her greater influence over such treasured pieces? That was the question quietly shaking the corridors of power. Camilla's supporters, according to speculation, had expected a different outcome, perhaps a slower decision, perhaps a more traditional route, perhaps a choice that honored the current queen's place inside the family. But instead, the focus turned toward William and Catherine's daughter, the young princess, who represents not the present reign, but the reigns still to come. And that is what made the decision so explosive. It suggested that legacy had moved past personal preference. It suggested that Queen Elizabeth's protected world, the Queen Mother's memory, and the future of the crown were being tied together through Charlotte. A child became the symbol of a silent royal verdict. And for those who understood palace language, that verdict was devastating. But the true significance of the sapphire set wasn't about jewels, it was about what the Queen Mother intended those jewels to represent. Long before Charlotte was born, the Queen Mother had already begun shaping a legacy that would outlive generations. Hidden behind public ceremonies and official portraits was a private collection of sapphires carrying decades of royal history, family loyalty, and deeply personal meaning. To outsiders, they may have looked like rare stones set in gold and diamonds, but inside the monarchy, pieces like these are never just ornaments, they become witnesses. They carry the weight of private promises, silent sacrifices, and family choices that are often never spoken aloud. And that is why this collection, linked so closely to the Queen Mother's name, became one of the most guarded symbols in the royal story. The sapphires reportedly belonged to a chapter of royal life defined by endurance. They reflected a generation that survived scandal, war, public pressure, and personal grief without allowing the crown to crack in public. The Queen Mother understood image, but she understood duty even more. Every jewel she wore was part of a message. Strength without panic, elegance without weakness, loyalty without complaint. Over time, those sapphires became wrapped in that same meaning. They were not remembered simply because they sparkled. They were remembered because they belonged to a woman who knew how to protect the monarchy when the ground beneath it was shaking. That is what made the private talk around the collection so powerful. Reports suggest that within royal circles, inheritance was never treated as a casual family matter. It was discussed carefully, quietly, almost fearfully, because every piece carried a question: who was worthy to hold it next? Some believed the sapphires would remain close to the most senior women of the family, passed only through hands already tested by years of service. Others whispered that Queen Elizabeth herself understood certain treasures had to wait for the right future, not merely the nearest title. and in that silence the collection became almost untouchable. For years, many assumed it would never move beyond the inner circle of senior royals. The Queen Mother's jewels belonged to a world of tradition, old loyalties, and careful control. They were not pieces to be used for popularity, revenge, or status. They were a royal language, and only a few people truly understood how to speak it. So when Charlotte's name later became connected to them, it did not feel like a simple inheritance. It felt like a message sent across generations, from the women who carried the crown through storms to the young princess expected to carry its dignity into the future. Yet as the years passed, another powerful figure began imagining a very different future for those treasured sapphires. For years, royal observers speculated about who would ultimately control some of the monarchy's most valuable heirlooms. Behind closed doors, expectations reportedly formed, alliances quietly developed, and assumptions hardened into certainty until everything suddenly changed. After Camilla became queen, those expectations only grew stronger. To some around the palace, her new position seemed to place her closer than ever to the jewels, the ceremonies, and the private symbols that define royal authority. And when a historic sapphire set linked to the Queen Mother became the subject of quiet discussion, many assumed the path ahead was already clear. That assumption became dangerous. Because in royal life, what appears obvious from the outside can be completely wrong inside the institution. Titles matter, but history matters more. Rank carries weight, but bloodline, service, and future purpose can outweigh even the grandest public role. This is where the story began to sharpen. Camilla had risen from outsider to queen, from controversy to coronation, from public doubt to official recognition. Her journey was already one of the most dramatic transformations in modern royal history. So for her supporters, it reportedly seemed natural that she would have influence over jewels connected to the royal women who came before her. But the old rules of inheritance were never that simple. Royal collections move through trust, tradition, private wishes, family memory, and quiet judgment. Some pieces are worn by one person but preserved for another. Some appear in public for a season, then disappear for years. Some are never truly owned in the ordinary sense at all. They are held, protected, and passed forward when the family believes the time is right. That is why speculation grew so intense. If the Queen Mother's sapphires represented endurance and duty, then the question was not only who wanted them. The question was who embodied what they stood for. Many believed Princess Charlotte was far too young to enter that conversation. She was not yet a working royal. She had not carried the burden of state events, national grief, or palace storms. To those who viewed royal inheritance through age and seniority, her name seemed almost impossible. But to others, that was exactly the point. Charlotte did not represent the politics of the current moment. She represented the next chapter, untouched by old rivalries and unscarred by the battles that had consumed the adults around her. So when alternative reports began to surface, the shock was immediate. The expected path appeared to crack. The quiet confidence around Camilla's circle reportedly gave way to confusion, then tension, then disbelief. A collection many believed would remain tied to senior royal control was suddenly being discussed in connection with William and Catherine's daughter. And in that moment, the sapphires stopped being a private family treasure. They became a royal signal. Then came the moment that transformed years of assumptions into one of the most talked about royal controversies in recent memory. The announcement did not arrive with fanfare or celebration. Instead, it surfaced through carefully guarded palace channels, creating immediate confusion among those who thought they understood how royal inheritance worked. Suddenly, Charlotte's name was connected to a collection many believed was destined elsewhere. And that single connection changed the entire atmosphere around the sapphires. What had once been treated as a quiet matter of family preservation became a storm of questions, suspicion, and whispered outrage. At first, royal watchers reacted with disbelief. Charlotte, still so young, had been placed at the center of a legacy usually reserved for senior women who had already spent decades serving the crown. To some it seemed too early, to others it seemed too bold. But inside palace circles, the shock carried a sharper meaning. This was not simply about age, it was about rank, timing, and the invisible rules that decide who is trusted with the most personal symbols of monarchy. If Charlotte was truly being linked to the Queen Mother's Sapphire inheritance, then someone had made a decision that reached far beyond ordinary jewelry planning. Reports suggest that different corners of the palace responded in very different ways. Some saw the move as beautiful, almost poetic, a sign that the monarchy was protecting its future through William and Catherine's children. Others reportedly viewed it as a quiet humiliation for those who had believed the current royal order would control the next chapter of heirlooms. That is why Camilla's name again drifted into the conversation, not because any public battle had been declared, but because in royal life, silence can be louder than shouting. A jewel placed in one line of the family can feel like a door closing in another. The decision-making process quickly became the subject of intense speculation. Who approved it? Was it rooted in Queen Elizabeth's wishes? Did the Queen Mother leave behind private intentions known only to a narrow circle? Or was this a modern choice made to strengthen the image of continuity around the Wales family? No one outside the deepest palace channels could answer with certainty, and that uncertainty made the story more powerful. Every unanswered question became another spark. Soon, media attention began growing around the inheritance. Commentators debated whether Charlotte's connection to the Sapphires marked a generational shift. Royal communities studied every detail, every old appearance of the jewels, every mention of Queen Elizabeth's private choices. The Sapphires were no longer hidden history. They had become a signal, a warning, and perhaps even a verdict. Because when a royal treasure moves, power moves with it. But the inheritance itself was only part of the story, because the symbolism behind it carried an even greater message. As debate intensified, attention shifted away from the jewels and toward Charlotte herself. What qualities made her the ideal heir to such a historic collection? The answer, according to many royal observers, revealed far more about the monarchy's future than its past. Because Charlotte was not being discussed as a child caught inside adult politics. She was being discussed as a symbol of what the crown wanted to become: steady, disciplined, protected, and prepared long before the world fully understood her role. In recent years, Charlotte's public presence has quietly taken on a meaning larger than her age. She has appeared composed during major royal moments, aware of tradition, and often surprisingly confident in situations that would overwhelm many adults. That calmness has drawn comparisons to Queen Elizabeth, whose greatest strength was not loud power, but controlled duty. It has also reminded some observers of Princess Anne, who built her reputation not through glamour, but through toughness, loyalty, and refusal to bend under pressure. Those comparisons matter because royal families do not only pass down jewels, they pass down expectations. That is why the Sapphires became so important. If they truly were being tied to Charlotte, they were not being handed to her for beauty or attention. They were being placed near her name because of what she represents. The next generation, the Wales line, the future that William and Catherine are carefully raising in public and protecting in private. And in a monarchy often shaken by scandal, distance, family division, and fading trust, Charlotte's image offered something rare: continuity without chaos. The decision also suggested that the palace may be thinking far beyond the present reign. King Charles represents transition. William represents preparation. George represents succession. But Charlotte represents something equally powerful: the strengthening of the family around the heir. She is not the direct future monarch, yet her role could become vital, just as Princess Anne's became vital beside the crown. The Sapphires, in that sense, were more than inheritance. They were a quiet assignment, a signal that loyalty has its own throne, even when it does not wear the crown. For Catherine, this connection would carry deep emotional weight. As a mother, she would understand that Charlotte was not simply receiving history, she was being placed inside it. That kind of legacy is beautiful, but it is also heavy. It demands dignity before freedom, silence before explanation, duty before personal comfort. And perhaps that is why many observers believed Charlotte made sense. She already appeared to understand the rhythm of royal life, even in small ways. So the praise grew. The idea of Charlotte holding the Queen Mother's sapphires began to feel less shocking and more deliberate. It gave the monarchy a story of renewal after years of tension. But praise inside one branch of the family can feel like rejection inside another. And, as praise for Charlotte grew, reports suggested that not everyone viewed the development with the same enthusiasm. Whenever a royal inheritance sparks debate, attention inevitably turns toward those who may feel overlooked. In this case, speculation quickly centered on Camilla, whose position within the family made every reported reaction a subject of intense scrutiny. She was not simply another relative watching from the edge of the story. She was queen, placed at the center of royal ceremony, royal symbolism, and public expectation. So when whispers suggested that the Queen Mother's Sapphire set was being linked to Princess Charlotte instead of remaining closer to the present Queen's influence, the silence around Camilla became almost as powerful as any statement. Media speculation moved quickly. Some claimed Camilla had every reason to feel wounded, not because the jewels belonged to her by right, but because royal life often operates through signals. A guest list can become a message, a seating plan can become a warning, a jewel can become a verdict. And in that language, Charlotte's connection to the Sapphires was interpreted by many as a quiet shift away from Camilla's circle and toward the Wales line. That interpretation was explosive, because it turned a private family matter into a public story about power. Yet there were also contrasting views. Some royal observers argued that Camilla had no reason to be involved at all, because the collection was tied to the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth, and the older line of inheritance. Others believed the speculation was exaggerated, shaped more by public fascination than palace reality. But the uncertainty only made the story stronger. When nobody can confirm the full truth, every pause, every carefully worded denial, and every absence becomes part of the drama. That is how royal controversies survive. They feed on silence inside royal communities. The debate grew louder. Was this a sign that Camilla's influence was beginning to narrow after reaching its highest point at the coronation? Was it a reminder that official status does not always equal emotional legacy? Or was it simply a practical decision being twisted into a family rivalry? The answers depended on who was speaking. Supporters of Camilla saw unfair targeting. Admirers of William and Catherine saw a powerful statement of continuity. And those watching from the outside saw something deeper. A monarchy quietly choosing which branch of the family would carry its most sacred symbols forward. Perception became almost impossible to separate from reality. Even if Camilla never objected, the story still carried the feeling of a setback. Even if the palace viewed the arrangement as routine, the public saw tension. And because royal power often depends on how things appear, that perception mattered. It made the Sapphires feel less like jewels and more like a line drawn across the future. That is why the story continued dominating headlines, because beneath the glamour was a harder question about influence, memory, and succession. Yet beyond personal reactions, a larger battle was unfolding over what the inheritance represented for the crown itself. Royal jewels have never been merely decorative. They function as symbols of continuity, authority, and trust. That is why Charlotte's connection to the Queen Mother's sapphires quickly became viewed as something much larger than an inheritance. It became a statement about the monarchy's future direction. It suggested that the crown was not only looking backward toward memory, but forward toward survival, carefully choosing which young figures would carry the weight of history into a more uncertain age. In royal life, heirlooms speak when people cannot. A necklace can soften a public appearance, a brooch can honor a lost monarch, and a tiara can remind the nation that the institution is older than any single reign. That is why the Queen Mother's sapphires carried such force. They were tied to a woman remembered for steadiness during pressure, for public warmth during private strain, and for protecting the monarchy when its future was not guaranteed. To link Charlotte with that legacy was to place her inside the same language of endurance. The public fascination grew because people understood the deeper meaning, even if the palace never explained it directly. Charlotte was not being presented as a rival to anyone. She was being positioned as part of a future framework. George may one day carry the crown, but Charlotte may carry something equally important: the emotional strength around it. Every strong monarchy depends not only on the sovereign, but on the loyal figures standing close enough to support, protect, and stabilize. In that sense, her connection to the Sapphires felt like preparation, not reward. It also renewed interest in William and Catherine's children as more than young royals appearing at family events. They became symbols of a generational handover. The monarchy, still recovering from public divisions and private wounds, needed signs of order. Charlotte offered that sign. Her role suggested calm after conflict, duty after drama, and inheritance after uncertainty. The Sapphires became a bridge between the Queen Mother's old world and the Wales family's future path. Tradition was at the center of it all. Royal families survive because they preserve meaning across time. They do not simply pass down objects. They pass down responsibility. That is why this story mattered so much to the public. It shaped perception. It made people ask whether the institution was quietly reorganizing itself around William, Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis. And if that was true, then Camilla's rumored disappointment was only one part of a much larger shift. Because the true power of the Sapphires was not their value. It was their direction. They seemed to point away from old arguments and toward a new royal generation being prepared in silence. And once the public sensed that, the story became impossible to ignore. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire story is what it reveals about the lasting power of royal legacies. In the end, the story was never truly about Sapphires. It was about legacy. It was about how one generation quietly reaches across time to influence another. It was about a young princess finding herself connected to a royal history that stretches back far beyond her years. From the first whispers inside palace circles to the growing speculation around Camilla's reported disappointment, every part of this controversy pointed to something deeper than a private jewelry decision. It revealed how royal inheritance can become a battlefield without anyone raising their voice. The Queen Mother's influence remained at the heart of it all. Even years after her passing, her name still carried a kind of quiet authority inside the royal story. She represented survival, dignity, and emotional strength during some of the monarchy's hardest chapters. That is why the Sapphire collection felt so powerful. It was not just connected to wealth. It was connected to memory. It reminded people of a royal generation that believed duty came first, silence had meaning, and family treasures were never meant to serve personal pride. Charlotte's growing place within that history made the story even more emotional. She is still young, yet her name has already become part of a wider conversation about the monarchy's future. The public fascination is not only about who receives what, it is about what those choices reveal. Every inheritance tells a story, every royal symbol points somewhere, and in this case, the Sapphires seem to point toward the Wales children, toward continuity, and toward a future shaped by William and Catherine's line. That is why the reaction became so intense. To some, Charlotte's connection to the Sapphires looked like a beautiful tribute. To others, it looked like a devastating reminder that influence inside the royal family can change without warning. Camilla's rumored place in the controversy added tension, but the larger message was bigger than any one person. The crown was showing, quietly and carefully, that legacy does not always follow public rank. Sometimes it follows trust. Sometimes it follows memory. Sometimes it follows the future. And that is what made this chapter so unforgettable. The Sapphire set became a bridge between the Queen Mother's world and Charlotte's destiny. It linked past courage with future responsibility. It turned a young princess into a living part of royal continuity before she had even stepped fully into her role. In a family built on symbols, that kind of connection matters. It tells the public that the monarchy is still thinking ahead, still protecting its story, still choosing which hands will carry its most sacred memories forward. And as the Queen Mother's Sapphires prepare to begin a new chapter, one question continues to linger: what other royal legacies are already being quietly passed to the next generation? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.